evening, good vach, shavua tov. I hope everybody had a beautiful Shabbos and we're ready to be refreshed and move into a new week. And started off right with some beautiful learning. Who's in the house on a Saturday night, burning the midnight oil, almost literally? Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Shandora in the Bronx, Molly in New York. Hello, my beloved daughter. Melissa in Great Neck, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Warning, I gotta move fast because I gotta get out of here and get on a plane. Gonna go visit my dad in Florida. The plan as of now, assuming that his Wi-Fi holds up and I can make these, I'm gonna take a reduced set of this production gear that I use to transmit the show to you, assuming I can get it working in Florida. I'm gonna keep teaching on the same schedule, at least Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, if it all works out. Wednesday, I'm scheduled to be traveling when the class time would be. So either we'll just have to do a makeup for Wednesday or it'll be at a different time. I'll let you know as we get closer with God's help. Our daf tonight is page 38, Lamed Ches, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Tonight we open a new Mishna, Mishna number 4, here in chapter 3. In the case of one who deposits produce with another, even if it is lost due to spoilage or vermin, the bailee may not touch it, as it is not his. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says he sells it before the court, as by doing so he is like one returning a lost item to the owner, since through selling the produce he prevents the owner from losing the value of his produce, right? So you have a barn, I have many bushels of wheat. My barn, something happened to it. I've got to store my wheat in your barn. Okay, so it's my wheat in your barn, and the basic halacha, the basic law is you don't touch it. You've agreed to store it. Maybe you're getting paid, maybe you're not, but you don't touch it. Even if its time is dragging on and it's starting to spoil. If it starts to spoil quickly, as we'll see, then it would be different. But in the normal course of things, you've agreed to store it, you don't touch it. Okay, that's the basic law. Now the Gemara. What is the reason that the first Tana of our Mishnah said that the bailee should not touch the produce? Rav Kahana says that it is based on the principle a person prefers a cob of his own produce to 9 cob of another person's produce. Consequently, despite the spoilage, the owner prefers that the bailee not touch the produce. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says we are concerned that perhaps the one who deposited the produce rendered it teruma, set aside the first 2% as a tithe to be given to the Kohen, to a priest. And then you definitely can't touch it if you're storing it, because teruma is only to be given to the priest. It is consecrated food. It cannot be used by anyone else besides the priest that it's going to be given to. So we're concerned that the one who deposited the produce rendered it or part of it teruma and tithe for produce and tithe for produce and meiser. So teruma and first tithe, and he did that from another place. It was deposited in your barn, and I was away overseas. But while I was overseas, I thought to myself, okay, I've got produce from 3 different farms that I own, and what I'm going to do is all the produce that I'm storing in your barn, I'm going to use as meiser and teruma for the produce that I'll harvest in my other fields. You don't know that. But because it's possible, you don't want to touch that produce. That's the explanation of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak why you can't touch the produce. That's my produce stored in your barn. Now the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. In the case of one who deposits produce with another, the bailee may not touch it. And therefore, this is important, therefore, the owner may render it teruma or tithe for produce in another place, right? Now, what we just said, according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, is that the reason you can't touch it is because I might have made a mental heshbon, a mental calculation to set aside the produce in your barn as tithe and teruma, right? As meiser and teruma. And that's why you can't touch it. But now we're getting an objection from a baraisa that it's because you can't touch it that I might have rendered it produce from another place. Since if I didn't know that you're not allowed to touch it, I wouldn't know if it's still there in your barn, and so I could not make that mental designation of what's in your barn to be tithe and teruma. So it's a causation, right? Is it because I might have rendered it meiser that you can't touch it, or is it because you can't touch it that I might have rendered it meiser? That's the chicken and egg dilemma that we're having here. Right, so the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. In the case of one who deposits produce with another, the bailee may not touch it, and therefore the owner may render it teruma or tithe for produce in another place. So granted, according to Rav Kahana, this is the reason that the Tana teaches, and therefore the owner renders them teruma. The concern that the owner may render the produce teruma and tithe is not the reason why the bailee may not sell it, and the law that the owner may render the produce teruma and tithe results from the law that the bailee may not sell it. You may not touch it, you may not sell it. Now remember, you would sell it because it's starting to spoil. You're doing it for my benefit. But the sages have a law. No, you can't sell it. So what's the reason? Either it's because I might have rendered it teruma, that's why you can't sell it, or there's some other reason why you can't sell it, but knowing that you can't sell it, that's why I would feel free to make that mental designation, even though I'm somewhere else. But according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, what is the meaning of the term therefore? According to his explanation, the fact that the owner may render the produce teruma and tithe is the very reason why the bailee may not sell the produce. So the Gemara explains, this is what the Tana is saying. Now that the sages said that the bailee may not sell the produce due to the fact that we are concerned that perhaps the owner had rendered it teruma, the owner can be confident that the produce is still in the possession of the bailee. Therefore, the owner may render it teruma and tithe for produce in another place, even ab initio. So it sounds like both opinions are agreeing that the reason he can render it teruma is because the guy can't sell it. But is the reason he can't sell it because he might render it teruma? Sounds like we're not really sure, but at the very least, yes, the world is such that he can't sell it. Perhaps because we're afraid that the absentee owner might have rendered it teruma. But now that this has become the law, then for sure the owner can feel confident that he can render it teruma because the bailee can't sell it. Got it? Okay. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan says the dispute in the Mishnah is in a case where the produce deteriorates at its standard rate of deterioration. All produce gets old. But if the produce deteriorates at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration, then everyone agrees that the bailee sells it before the court. In other words, it's just produce sitting in a barn, and we can say, I don't know, however many weeks or months or years you could expect that the produce would go bad, then that's just standard deterioration. But if something's happening, there's a leak in the barn, there's some kind of infestation, who knows what, okay, then obviously the owner would prefer that the bailee sell that produce and turn it into money rather than have a total loss. Everyone agrees that the bailee, and how does he sell it? He sells it before the court. He doesn't just go do it on his own because, he could have incentive to be a little bit, self-dealing, as it were. So since he's selling it on the behalf of the absentee owner, he has to do it, before a court with people witnessing to make sure that it's done, accurately and honestly. So the Gemara comments that Rabbi Yochanan certainly disagrees with the opinion of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, as the concern that the owner might have rendered the produce teruma or tithe applies regardless of the rate of deterioration. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with the opinion of Rav Kahana? And the Gemara answers, when Rav Kahana says that one prefers his own produce, it was in a case where the produce deteriorates at its standard rate of deterioration that he says it. When the rate of deterioration is accelerated, he would agree that the bailee sells the produce. And the Gemara asks, but didn't Rav Kahana say a person prefers a cob of his own produce to 9 cob of another's produce? Now, is that the underlying reason why he doesn't want it sold? Even if it's deteriorating, he doesn't want it sold, and therefore that's why a person can't touch it? And it's because that's the reason that it shouldn't be sold, that the sages said you can't sell it. And then afterward, we have the understanding that the absentee owner can render it teruma, but maybe the underlying reason that the bailee can't sell it is because a person would prefer to have his own produce rather than somebody else's produce, even if his produce is deteriorating, at least at the standard rate of deterioration. And the Gemara asks, but didn't Rav Kahana say a person prefers a cob of his own produce to 9 cob of another's produce? This indicates that even if the rate of deterioration was accelerated, one prefers his own produce. As in the case, he describes 8/9 of the produce is lost, right? Prefers a cob of his own to 9 cobs of someone else. And the Gemara answers, this expression is merely an exaggeration for effect. It's a rhetorical device. And actually, one prefers his own produce only when its rate of deterioration is standard. If something it's starting to rot quickly, of course he would prefer that it would be sold. And the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. Therefore, the owner renders it teruma or tithe for produce in another place. And let the owner be concerned that perhaps the produce deteriorated at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration. The absentee owner, knowing that the law is that the bailee isn't going to touch it, he could make that mental designation to set aside all or some of it as tithe and teruma. But now that we've said that if for some reason the produce is deteriorating quickly, that the bailee will sell it, well, then he would have made this mental designation on produce that no longer is his to tithe, since the bailee sold it because it was deteriorating faster. Since he can't know whether some mishap caused the produce to deteriorate quickly, how can he feel free to make a designation of tithe or teruma while he's absent? That's the question being asked. And the Gemara answers, deterioration at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration is uncommon, and the sages do not issue decrees for uncommon cases. And the Gemara asks, and if it is found that more of the produce is missing than would be lost according to the standard rate of deterioration, then what should be done? According to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, do we sell it? But let us be concerned that perhaps the owner already rendered the produce teruma and tithe for produce in another place. And the Gemara answers, even when we sell the produce, it is to priests at the price of teruma that we sell it. Consequently, even if the owner rendered it teruma, it is consumed by priests, and therefore there is no concern. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak as well, since the concern is that perhaps the owner rendered the produce teruma, let the bailee sell the produce to priests at the price of teruma. And the Gemara answers, it is with regard to this that they disagree, as Rabba Bar Hana holds deterioration at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration is not common at all. And when it occurs that the produce deteriorated at that faster rate, it is only from now on that it is assumed that it became deteriorated at a greater rate than its standard rate of deterioration. Therefore, if the owner had rendered the produce teruma and tithe for produce from another place, it is assumed that it was before it began deteriorating at a rate greater than the standard rate of deterioration that he made that mental designation. And therefore, when the produce deteriorated at that faster rate, the bailee should sell the produce to priests at the price of teruma, since it may be teruma, because the owner made that designation while he was absent. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak holds deterioration at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration is common. Of course this can happen. And when the produce became deteriorated at a rate greater than its standard rate, it may be immediately that it became deteriorated to that extent. And if you say, let us sell it, the concern is that at times the bailee will sell it early. And when the owner renders the produce teruma and tithe for produce from another place, he does not know that the bailee already sold the produce. And therefore, the owner who was thinking to himself, this produce that I have in my other field over in Colorado, that I'm going to use the field, the produce in your barn as its tithe, now that you've sold it because it was deteriorating faster, so then the produce that he's starting to eat in Colorado and selling to other people, etc., assuming that it is tithed, is not tithed. And then he would be committing a transgression. You cannot eat untithed produce. So we're protecting him from coming to make that transgression. That's what this is all about. So the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa in the case of one who deposits produce with another, and it rotted, wine and it fermented, oil and it putrefied, honey and it spoiled, and all similar cases to what we're talking about here. So in those cases, the bailee may not touch them. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis, the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, say he effects a remedy for these items and sells them in court. It starts to rot, sell it so that it doesn't totally rot and it's a total loss. And the baraisa adds, and when he sells them to others, and he does not sell them to himself, even for the same price, so that no one will suspect that he bought it at a discount, serving himself. On a similar note, with regard to charity collectors, when they do not have poor people to whom to distribute charity, they change copper perusos, those are the smallest coins there were, like pennies, that they collected for more valuable silver coins only for other people. But they do not change the coins for themselves to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. If collectors for the charity plate collected ready-made food for the poor at a time when there are no poor people to whom to distribute the food, so they sell the food only to others, but they do not sell the food to themselves. In any event, it is taught if there was produce and it rotted, which is now it's relevant to our Mishnah today, what? Is it not referring even to a case where they all rotted at a greater rate than its standard rate of deterioration? And the Gemara rejects this idea. No. It is referring to a case where they deteriorated at their standard rate of deterioration. So that would seem to imply that the bailee will sell the produce even if it's deteriorating at its normal rate, which is a contradiction to our Mishnah that says you don't do that, only if it's starting to rot very fast. And the Gemara asks, but aren't the cases of wine and it fermented, oil and it putrefied, and honey and it spoiled, cases where these items deteriorated at a greater rate than their standard rate of deterioration, as there is a significant difference in the price of wine before and after fermentation and in the price of oil before and after putrefaction? And plus we know that it must be rotting at a greater rate than normal if we're also talking about honey, because honey, I think they found honey from ancient Egypt and it was still edible. Honey does not go bad in normal cases, but there are some abnormal cases where even honey does go bad. Now, the Gemara rejects this proof. Those cases are different. Once those become spoiled, right, so oil and wine and this produce, they remain spoiled, but they do not continue to deteriorate. It's like they're good, then they're bad. It's not this slope of becoming bad. Therefore, although their deterioration was significant, there's nothing gained by selling it. You're not protecting further loss. It's already happened. On a related note, the Gemara asks concerning the cases of oil and it putrefied or honey and it spoiled, well, for what are they fit? How could you even sell it? Who wants putrefied oil or spoiled honey? And according to the rabbis, one does sell them in court. And apparently they must have some value. And the Gemara answers oil that putrefied is fit for tanners who would coat the hides with oil even if they had a foul odor, even if it had a foul odor. And honey that spoiled is fit as a salve for a wound on the backs of camels. We're on page 38b. It is taught in the baraisa, and the rabbis say that the bailee effects a remedy for the spoiled products and sells them in court. And the Gemara asks, what remedy does he effect for those products? And Rav Ashi said it is a remedy for the casks. Although the contents of the barrel are irreversibly spoiled, leaving the spoiled wine in the barrels will ruin the barrels. Now, why are we selling it? Why don't we just dump it? Maybe someone has a use for this fermented wine, but for sure we got to get it out of the barrels. And the Gemara asks, since Rabbi Meir agrees that when there is deterioration at a rate greater than its standard rate of deterioration, the bailee should sell the deposit. So with regard to what issue do Rabbi Meir and the rabbis disagree? And the Gemara answers, the dispute is that one sage, Rabbi Meir, holds that the sages were concerned for a significant loss, but the sages were not concerned for an insignificant loss, like damage to the barrels. And the other sage, the rabbis, who overrule Rabbi Meir, hold that the sages were concerned even for an insignificant loss, and therefore the bailee should take action to avoid even that small loss to the owner of the deposit. New subject. The Mishnah teaches that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says he sells it before the court due to the fact that in doing so he is like one returning a lost item to the owner. And it was stated that Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Yaakov, says that Rabbi Yochanan says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And Rabba says that Rav Nachman says the law is in accordance with the statement of the rabbis. So the Gemara asks, but why was it necessary for Rabbi Yochanan to issue that ruling specifically in this case? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan already say one other time that in general the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, right? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. As Rabba Bar Chana says, that Rabbi Yochanan said, every place where Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught a ruling in our Mishnah, the law is in accordance with his opinion, except for 3 cases. The responsibility of the guarantor, which we learn in Bava Basra 173b, and the incident that occurred in the city of Tzaidan, Gittin 74a, and the dispute with regard to evidence in the final disagreement at Sanhedrin 31a. We don't need to explore those cases right now. Those are just the only 3 times that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was not the final authority, that his ruling did not become authoritative. Now, by inference, in all other cases, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the law is in accordance with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Bar Chana are Amoraim, right, sages of the Gemara, and they disagree with regard to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. They're disagreeing on what was it that Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Abba holds that there was no general ruling, and therefore a ruling was necessary in this case, and Rabbi Bar Chana holds that Rabbi Yochanan did issue that general ruling that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is always right, except in those 3 cases. And the Gemara notes, from the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, it is learned that the court authorizes a relative who is the heir apparent to descend and to manage the property of a captive. Right? So if somebody was taken hostage, and while he's away, so somebody's going to step in and take care of his property. Okay, who? Well, the most obvious case is the one who stands to inherit the property if the captive is actually revealed to be dead. He's going to take the best care of it because he has a personal interest in it. A bailee who sells rotting produce is like one returning a lost item to the owner. Now, one who manages the property of a captive who is unable to do so himself should have, the captive who is unable to do it himself, the one who's watching his property should have the same status as somebody who is returning a lost item, right? That's why you would sell this produce that has started rotting quickly, to save the owner from loss. So from this statement of the rabbis who say that the bailee may not touch even the rotting produce, it is learned that the court does not authorize a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. And the Gemara rejects this parallel. How can you say that? And from where do you draw such a conclusion? Perhaps Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel states his opinion here only due to the fact that the principle, i.e. the rotting produce, is already rotted. It's already destroyed. But there, indeed, the court does not authorize a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive because the land lies fallow and the land will remain intact even if the captive will not profit. And perhaps the rabbis state their opinion only here based either on the reason of Rav Kahana, that a person prefers his own produce, or the reason of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, that there is concern that perhaps the owner designated the produce as teruma or tithe. But there, with regard to a captive's property, those reasons do not apply. And indeed, the court does authorize the relative to step in and manage the property of the captive who can't do it himself. So the Gemara asks, is this to say that they are 2 independent reasons for these laws? But doesn't Rav Yehuda say that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? And Shmuel says the court authorizes a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. Is it not due to the fact that there is one common reason for both laws? And the Gemara rejects that reasoning. No, they are based upon 2 unrelated reasons. And Shmuel ruled the law in each case independently. The Gemara comments, so too it is reasonable to say that the 2 laws are unrelated. As Rava says that Rav Nachman says the law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And Rav Nachman says the court authorizes the relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. So rather, learn from it that they are based on two unrelated reasons. And the Gemara affirms, indeed, learn from it that they are unrelated. And the Gemara notes that it was stated that there is an Amoraic dispute, right? Tanaim, sages of the Mishna redacted in the year 200 of the Common Era. Amoraim, sages of the Gemara period, which was from 200 to 500 of the Common Era. So it was stated that there is a dispute among the Amoraim with regard to one who was taken captive. Rav says the court does not authorize a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. Shmuel says the court authorizes a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. So the Gemara limits the scope of their dispute. In a case where they heard that the captive died, everyone agrees that the court authorizes the relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. The relative is the prospective heir and will tend to the land as if it were his own. If the captive indeed returns, he will compensate the relative for his expenditures. Where they disagree, it is in a case when they did not hear that the captive had died, and presumably, they have no reason to assume that he won't return. They pray he'll return. Something could happen to him, but as of now, they believe he will return. So in that case, Rav says the court does not authorize a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive, lest he devalue the property. Right? Who is this relative? How do you know he's going to take care of the land well? Maybe he'll step in and do something stupid and make the land worth less. Don't let him step in and start taking over. Better that the land should just lie fallow. After all, it's land. How bad is it going to be? If it's some other property that's going to deteriorate quickly because no one's taking care of it, that would be a different result. But somebody to step in and start managing land, we don't do that as long as there's a chance the captive is going to come back. That's according to Rav. Since presumably the owner of the property is alive, the relative assumes that he will eventually be required to return the property to the owner. Therefore, he does not tend to the land as if it were his own, but will farm the land to increase its short-term yield, and this could be at the expense of its long-term condition. That's Rav's opinion. Shmuel says, yes, the court authorizes the relative to descend and manage the property of a captive, since the master said in any case where one works a field that is not his, we appraise his work as if he were a sharecropper. The relative will not devalue the property. It is in his best interest to tend to the land to ensure that he will receive his payment as a sharecropper while he's managing the land. The Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, by inference from that which is stated, Exodus 22:23, my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you. I know that their wives shall be widows and their children orphans. Rather, what is the meaning when the verse states, and your wives will be widows and your children orphans? The continuation of that verse. Why is this clause in the verse necessary? And the verse teaches an additional punishment, that the men will be killed with no witnesses. The wives will seek to marry, and the courts will not allow them to do so because there were no witnesses that their husbands died. And their children will wish to descend to their father's property to inherit it, and the courts will not allow them to do so. This is an additional form of punishment from above. Apparently, the court does not authorize a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive. So Rava said, we learned in the Baraisa that the courts do not allow them to descend and to sell the land, but the court does authorize a relative to descend and manage the land. And the Gemara relates there was a similar incident in Nehardea, and Rav Sheshes resolved the matter from this baraisa and ruled that a court does not authorize a relative to descend to the property of a captive. Rav Amram said to him, perhaps we learned in the baraisa that the courts do not allow a relative to descend and to sell the land. Rav Sheshes said mockingly to him, employing a similar style, perhaps you are from Pumbedisa, where people pass an elephant through the eye of a needle, i.e., they engage in specious reasoning. But doesn't the juxtaposition between their wives and their children in the verse teach that the meaning is similar in both cases? And just as there, with regard to the wives, it means that they may not remarry at all. So too here, with regard to the sons, it means that they may not descend to the property at all. Not just they can't sell it, they can't even step in and manage it. And the Gemara comments, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara comments in the matter of whether the court authorizes a relative to descend and manage the property of a captive is a dispute between the Tanaim. As it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of one who descends to the property of a captive and works his field, the court does not confiscate it from his possession. And furthermore, even if he had heard that the owners are approaching and arriving, and the one who descended to the field preceded their arrival and uprooted and consumed the produce that grew that year, that person is deemed diligent and he profits, and he received a return on the work that he invested. And these are the cases where there is captive's property, meaning cases where one's father or brother or one of those relatives who bequeaths him an inheritance went to a country overseas, and those in his locale heard that the relative died. They heard he died. They don't know that he died. They haven't heard from witnesses that he died. So he's like a captive who may or may not return. And so what we've been arguing about is whether the relatives step in and manage the land or not, possibly even sell the land if there's a reason to do so. That's where we're going to leave off. And with God's help, we'll pick it up there tomorrow, Monday, at our regular time. God willing, I'll be able to broadcast from my father's house in Florida. Looks like just one question from Sharon. Can rotten produce really still be used as tithe or teruma? Can't the money equivalent better serve in that capacity? But the problem is, right, if it's sold before he makes that designation, then the designation was imaginary. There was nothing to designate. When they're saying that it's sold at the price of teruma, because they don't know whether he designated or not, but if it was rotten, can it be used? I mean, it's a very interesting question. I don't know that the fact that it has fermented or gone bad, that it is less than ideal, actually disqualifies it from being teruma, right? Because teruma needs to be ritually pure, right? In a state of tahara. But that doesn't mean, that just means it has not come into contact with tuma, right? With sources of ritual impurity, like a dead creeping thing, a sheretz. The fact that it just, fermented and is less than ideal, even if it's kind of a little gross, like mold, for example, that could be in teruma and it's still teruma. Maybe no one wants to eat it, but I don't know that would disqualify it from being teruma. Would it be less than ideal? Of course. You want to make teruma, should come from your best because it's consecrated property. But I don't think there's any automatic disqualification. That's what I've got for us tonight. My friends, you should have a beautiful, uplifting, productive